It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. We turn now to the U.S. birth rate. Provisional Centers for Disease Control data released back in April show that U.S. fertility rates hit another record low in 2025, marking a 23% decline since 2007. The data show that one of the biggest contributors driving down the birth rate is that the teenage birth rates fell significantly, down 7 points in 2025, for example, and births for women in their 40s increased. But it's still a huge decline overall that concerns policymakers from both sides of the aisle. Low birth rates impact economic growth overall, with smaller labor markets in the future and a smaller taxpayer base to fund programs like Social Security, the worker-to-retiree ratio. Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle are putting forward solutions, and they are vastly different. The right-wing Heritage Foundation put forward a plan earlier this year that seems to put the onus on women to forego careers and get married and have kids earlier. Progressives, like New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani, are more focused on affordability, providing things like free universal childcare. To explain what's going on with the data and which approaches, if any, might be effective, we're joined by two guests. Jill Filipovic is an attorney, columnist at Slate, and has a Substack called Throughline. And Karen Guzzo is the director of the Carolina Population Center and a sociology professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She's one of the leading family demographers in this country. Jill, welcome back to WNYC, and Karen, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Happy to be here.
Karen, as a demographer, can you flesh this out for us a little bit? How much has the birth rate declined over what period of time?
Sure. The birth rate has fallen quite a bit, and it's really been a consistent decline since the Great Recession. So there's a long history that shows that whenever there's a recession, birth rates fall. But what typically happens is the economy recovers and birth rates recover. And that is not the story we've seen in the United States or any other high-income country for that matter. So birth rates have fallen quite a bit. And as you had pointed out, the biggest drop is really among teen births. So those have fallen about 70% since the Great Recession. And typically we would think that's good news given how long the United States spent trying to reduce our teen birth rate. But it does put us at the point where, although births are increasing in the later ages 30 and above or 35 and above, they're not increasing nearly enough to offset the dramatic declines we're seeing at younger ages. And so we are at a level that is below what's considered replacement level. So on average, women should replace themselves and a partner to maintain population stability. And so we're below that number right now. Although we are, we do have immigration and we have a long life expectancy, and so population can still grow even if birth rates are falling.
And we'll get to the immigration aspect of it and where race comes in with respect to that. But Jill, you've written a lot about what's going on with people finding partners later in life and those who have kids having the kids later in life. How does marriage, how do these choices come into the equation for you as a commentator?
Well, I think one thing that's important to note is that this is not just a dynamic in the U.S. This is a dynamic all over the world. Birth rates are dropping, and they're dropping mostly because of pretty good news. Girls are staying in school longer. Women are graduating from college in higher numbers. Women are delaying marriage. All of that is overwhelmingly positive. Fewer teen pregnancies. Part of the outcome of women going into the workforce and having lives that we are choosing ourselves is that we can afford to be pickier about partners. Women in America are far less dependent on men for basic financial stability and also for kind of social and cultural affirmation than we've perhaps ever been. And one outcome of that is that you don't see quite so many women getting married in their 20s. And so that means even though we have seen births and marriage become somewhat decoupled in the United States, they are still relatively strongly related. And so we're seeing birth rates go down. I don't quite see that as the panic-inducing moment that I think a lot of commentators do. But I think it certainly does speak to the need for some more progressive public policies that allow women to have the number of children that they would like.
Well, I think the panic, where there is panic, does have to do with the economics that Karen was starting to describe, particularly the future of Social Security and Medicare if we have too small a worker to retiree ratio, no?
Absolutely. And I can understand why that's a concern. I do think that maybe would be a useful moment to rethink whether the way that we structure those social support systems is necessarily one that makes sense in a country where we're also, as you mentioned earlier, beginning to pretty heavily limit immigration. This country can support many more people. We know immigrants are a huge boon for the American economy for things like Medicaid and Medicare and Social Security. I certainly think that we should be taking into account the need to allow women and men to have the number of children that they want and to form the families that they want. But immigration in a country like the US is just going to have to be a pretty important cornerstone of supporting those social welfare programs going forward.
Listeners, do you think the declining birth rate in the United States is a cause for concern? And do you think government policy should address it, should encourage having more kids in one way or another? 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. Call or text for our guests, Jill Filipovic from Slate and her podcast Throughline, and our guest from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, Karen Guzzo, director of the Carolina Population Center there, a sociology professor and a leading U.S. demographer. 212-433-WNYC, 433-9692. Karen, you referenced immigration before. As a demographer, can you put some numbers on that? I think the U.S. has been better off in terms of maintaining a replacement rate than some other countries, Japan, South Korea, for example, where they don't have as much immigration and the birth rate is declining similarly, yes?
Yes, that's correct. So the U.S. birth rate has been below this replacement for a while, but because we've had high levels of immigration, we've actually been able to continue growing. And typically when people come to the United States, they come during their prime childbearing years. And so not only do they come and work and contribute to the population in that way and the economy in that way, but then they also stay here and their children are born here and they are contributing in another way in terms of population growth. So a place like Japan, which is pretty much closed off to immigration, that's not one of the levers that they can use to help boost their economy and the number of people paying into taxes and so forth. And so to me, what we're doing with immigration is really sort of shooting ourselves in the foot here, because immigration has always been sort of a strong component of both our economy and our population growth. And so if we're worried about, population decline, the idea that we would push off or, segment off an entire area that has been contributing to population growth just doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense.
And Jill, you wrote earlier this year, and I think I misspoke and said your podcast is called Throughline. It's your Substack that's called Throughline, correct?
That's correct. I should start a podcast, so it's fine. You've inspired me.
You can read the words from your Substack. That would be a good start. But you wrote about the Heritage Foundation's blueprint titled Saving America by Saving the Family, a foundation for the next 250 years. And you make the claim that the report wants to fix the falling birth rate by making women subservient to men. You use that word. Can you make that case?
Sure. So the Heritage Foundation's plan is not just intended to incentivize childbearing, but to incentivize couples to marry young and have babies young. And it creates a series of essentially financial rewards that only attach to couples who do both of those things, get married first and have a baby at a very young age. It also attaches financial rewards to couples where one member stays home. They don't say that member has to be the wife, but we know that overwhelmingly in the U.S., when one partner in a marriage stays at home. It's usually the woman. And the Heritage Foundation it's a conservative organization, so I think we can kind of make some educated guesses about what they think the best partner to do that is. The way that they justify this, and they're not wrong on this point, is that if couples start having children sooner, they tend to have more, right? If you have your first kid at 17, you're more likely to have more children later on than if you have your first kid at 35. The problem is that really only works if you pretty significantly decrease women's workforce participation and you essentially narrow the scope of options for women. The Heritage Foundation, also in Project 2025, wants to end abortion rights, wants to heavily restrict contraception, at least heavily restrict government funding of contraception. So what they are not trying to incentivize is allowing women and families to have as many kids as they want. And we do know from some surveys that families aren't having as many kids as they want. So I do think that's an important reality to take into account. Instead, what they're trying to do is really incentivize a very traditional patriarchal family structure in which there is a husband who is the breadwinner and has financial authority over the family. And there is a wife who marries young and begins having children kind of as soon as possible and as many as possible. I just don't think that's actually what the majority of American women want, given that now that we have other options, we're voting with our feet, we're not doing that.
In fact, you write that Heritage wants to slash welfare and cut support for single mothers because in their view it allows women to escape financial dependence on men, and they see a roof being put over a family's head through public assistance as, quote, a bad thing, as you characterize them. I guess where that confuses me is how does that square with their stated bottom line goal of getting more Americans to have more children when, they want to cut out the financial support for one lane for that, which is single mothers.
Right. I mean, they also don't support IVF, right? And we know that the group of women that is growing in terms of reproduction are women over the age of 35, many of whom are using reproductive technologies. So if you want to juice the birth rate, that would be a good place also to start. I think what they would say if they were on this call is that they are not interested in increasing birth rates by any means necessary. Instead, what they're interested in doing is creating what they would call, I think, a culture of life and a pro-family and pro-marriage culture. And that if you do that, if you essentially create kind of a conservative patriarchal culture, birth rates will increase, but in the context in which they believe it's appropriate to have children, which is within a marriage. And so, yes, they also propose essentially punishing women who don't go that path, pulling funds from single moms, pulling support from the children of single parents in order to encourage those women to be dependent, they would say, dependent on a husband instead of on the state.
So you're really saying theirs is a faux concern, a false concern with declining birth rate and really about rebuilding a society of trad wives.
I think it's a genuine concern, but I think it is a concern about changing gender roles that make them nervous. I think you also, when you see the hostility to immigration, I think it's also a concern about changing racial demographics. That is a pretty big part of some of the birth rate hysteria.
Right. Because if immigrants are having more kids than people who are born here, immigrants tend more to be people of color, if we want to use that phrase, whereas still, 60% of the population of the United States is white. So there's the racial component, though they'll never admit that, Karen, right? They'll always say we have an immigration crisis for other reasons, and we have a birth rate crisis, and they will say those things don't really connect and shouldn't be seen as connected. But what would happen if immigration rates, for you as a demographer, continued at the historic pace, let's say from the last 50, 60 years, and the birth rate in the country continued at the pace from the last 50, 60 years, where would we be in a couple of decades racially in this country?
Well, we're already at a point where the majority of births are not to white people; they're to other groups, and so that has already been a concern. And one of the things that demographers sometimes worry about is that when we just talk about, oh, are we when are we going to be a majority minority country, that we are not taking into consideration that some people are really going to panic over that. But it is the path that we're on, and so in some places, if you go to Texas or California, you might already find situations where the population is not majority white. And I think Jill's right that is a panic moment for many people. And so to me, I think there's maybe a little bit of legitimate panic or concern over low birth rates, but I really think what they're doing is using low birth rates as to whitewash these other concerns about gender roles and about racial change. And so that's where, I find it quite disingenuous because as you were saying, and as Jill was saying, if we were really worried about, having more children, we wouldn't put constraints on how we support those children or those children or whether they were born in two-parent married Christian families, for instance.
Tom in West Babylon, you're on WNYC. Hi, Tom.
Hello. So I'm just wondering, you always hear declining birth rates as a negative, but when you think about lack of affordable housing, lack of jobs, overconsumption of, fossil fuels or everything, isn't it a good thing? I mean, to me, there's too many people.
Karen, what would you say to Tom? A lot of people are probably nodding their heads right now thinking, wait, isn't overpopulation of the earth placing too much demand on global resources, climate related and in other ways, the overarching problem here as opposed to too few people?
Well, the real problem is not how many people we have, it's how we all live. So we really have a problem of overconsumption. And so, we could have Americans we use so much. So yes, it does make sense on some level that fewer people would help with that problem. But I think the bigger story to me is that, if people are being able to avoid having births that they didn't want to have, that's a good story. So most births that are to teenagers or even to, people in their early 20s are often unintended. And people not having births that they don't want, that sounds like a great thing. The problem really is, in my opinion, is not so much is there a magical number of births we need to be having at the population level, but as Jill has noted, lots of people say they want to have kids and are meeting up with barriers to doing that. So things like affordable housing or the cost of living, those are the real factors that are pushing people to say, I just don't know if I can have a kid.
Olivia in Hunterdon County, you're on WNYC. Hi, Olivia.
Hi. I missed the last little bit of what was said, but magical number I think hits on sort of what my question is about. I'm 34. I'm a millennial, so I remember very well in high school the worst possible thing that could happen to a teen girl was to get pregnant. The teen mom crisis was very much pushed on us as if it was a crisis. So I guess it's funny. So it's just funny to me now that the teen birth rate is falling. It was acknowledged that that's a good thing, but my question would be what is that magical number for this to not be a news story, whether it's too many teen moms or too few teen moms?
Yeah,
Jill?
I would say. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Jill.
Oh, go ahead, Karen. You want to take that first? Go ahead.
Sure. I would just say, I think what the magic number is really how many people are ending up, at age 40 or 45, feeling as if they missed their window and didn't have the number of kids they wanted. So most people still say they want to have 2 or even maybe 3 kids. And the fact that we're getting a lot of people who aren't at that point, that's the real concern. So I think it's not so much when people have kids, but if they're ever able to have the kids that they say they want to have.
Jill, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I think Karen is exactly right on that. And Olivia, I'm a millennial as well. And so I'm hearing something a little arch in your question, which is that so much of the narrative around our whole generation has just been about how we're always doing it wrong, right? So when we were teenagers, we were warned against, getting pregnant. And then a lot of us didn't get pregnant as teenagers. And now we're in our 30s and 40s and we're hearing we did it wrong again for not having enough kids. But I would just say that because births have also been pushed later and later, I think it's fairly clear that we're not going to return to the birth rates that we had, 40, 50 years ago. But if we're doing things like, calculating completed fertility by age 35 or even 40, we are missing some number of women who are having kids, in their late 30s, in their early and mid 40s. So I think it would also be useful to kind of rethink our assumptions about motherhood and when it should happen, when it can happen, and how we can use, for example, some pretty novel medical technologies to ensure that women can complete their families.
On what works in countries that are concerned about declining birth rates, policy-wise, Karen, you wrote about a recent review of decades of other countries' family policies that found attempts to raise birth rates, quote, are rarely successful. And the review considered three types of policies, cash benefits, parental leave, and childcare support that largely runs the gamut. So did those authors conclude, do you conclude reading that literature review, that government policy doesn't change anything in this respect one way or another?
Well, the thing that works the least well is the cash bonuses and tax breaks and stuff like that. Like, they're helpful, but I mean, I'm not going to say who doesn't want money, right? But they don't make a big difference because the cost of raising kids just is so monumental over, 18, 20, 25 years, let alone sort of the indirect cost of, having to cut back on your labor participation, maybe. The things that seem to help the most are the things that help people combine work and family. So things that like having a robust childcare infrastructure that you could actually afford and find a spot for your kid, and being able to take some time off when you give birth, and for fathers to get time off too. Having said that, it doesn't raise the birth rates from, if they're currently at like 1.6, it won't raise it to 2.1. It might raise it to, if it's at 1.6, it might raise it to 1.7, 1.8, which is an increase, and that's worth doing. But there doesn't seem to be sort of a magic cure that will automatically get us above that replacement level.
So looking at the partisan divide on what to do, something like New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani's proposal for free childcare because families with kids are leaving New York City. On the other hand, last month, President Trump said the government needs to fund the military, and so states should fund childcare if they can, but the federal government should not. So kind of saying this is not a national priority. Vice President J.D. Vance has said grandparents should chip in to babysit. So does the report suggest that either in the context of this country, the right-wing approach or the left-wing approach would be more successful?
Well, I would say that what's interesting is even if birth rates aren't increased dramatically by having childcare, if we're worried about our labor force participation, having childcare and paid leave would help get mothers in the workforce. If we're worried about having enough workers, why would we do something that's going to pull out a bunch of the workforce? And we also know that good childcare and paid leave is better for children's health. It's better for maternal health. Like, it just seems like a good investment to do, even if it doesn't raise birth rates.
And Jill, here's a text from a listener that says, low birth rate, thanks student debt. Agree with that?
Yeah, I don't think that's wrong either. But again, these are global trends, including in places where young people aren't saddled with student debt. So, look, I wrote a whole book about all the ways in which millennials got screwed, including student debt and lack of family-friendly policies and all these things. But as Karen says, no country has, no kind of comparable country has really figured out the silver bullet solution for how to really, really heavily juice birth rates. Now, I think the best thing the U.S. can do is figure out how to create a landscape in which families look at their situation and say, okay, I can afford to have a kid if I want one, or I can afford another kid, or this will work with my life. And I think Karen identifies kind of most of the biggest barriers there, childcare, paid leave. But I think one kind of underappreciated aspect as well is that millennials, we flocked to cities, and many of us have jobs that are tied to cities. We have communities and friends that are tied to the cities that we live in. And American cities in our lifetime have become incredibly unaffordable, and particularly unaffordable places to have kids. So the American right spends a lot of time thinking about culture change, thinking about how they can kind of impose their values on everyone around them. And I wonder if it would really behoove the left to think about how to make American cities places where more people could choose to have children. One thing the right says a lot is pregnancy is contagious. You see other people around you having kids, your friends have kids, your siblings have kids. It makes you more likely to do it. If you live in a big city like New York, you can spend all day long with people in their 30s and never see a child. And I think liberals could push for policies that would allow more families to stay in cities, have children, raise their kids there, and make that more of a norm. And again, it's not going to make women have 5 kids, but it might make them have 1 or 1 more.
Pregnancy is contagious. That's a phrase nobody ever said on the show before. That could be the headline of one of your Substacks. I'm just going to point out one other contradiction from the arguments on the right in this respect. The Centers for Disease Control reports that in 2022, 87% of women who got abortions, 87%, were unmarried. And so if they are the movement, Karen, of family values, you would think conservatives would want birth control or be soft on abortion to prevent children outside of wedlock.
Yeah, it's really a strange thing that's happening. I mean, this group is just so anti-abortion, but also anti-birth control, but also anti-social safety net. And so these are not they're not really coherent policies in my view. But to me, it's about hearkening back to getting women who, restricting women's roles so that they end up having to marry the guy that, they get pregnant with at 19 and can't really leave. I mean, we're also seeing efforts to roll back no-fault divorce. You're seeing movements against hormonal contraception, which is super safe and has been so well studied. And yet now, RFK is saying maybe we need to revisit that. Like, it's a very strange moment we're in right now.
Though most of the Republicans are lining up for IVF, we should say, in fairness, when that conversation started to break out publicly, right?
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yes and no.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Jill, go ahead. You get the last word.
Yeah, go.
Well, so a couple weeks ago, the Trump administration just released new guidance on Title X funding, which is the federal program that funds contraception for low-income women. And from that guidance, they essentially completely stripped out contraception and instead focused on things like natural family planning and basically ways to have women have more babies. IVF got no mention. The anti-abortion movement was very angry with Trump when he backed IVF. And as much as Trump talked about that during the campaign, and the anti-abortion movement was kind of publicly a little quieter about it to not, I guess, interfere with his potential presidency. Now that he's in office, he's done absolutely nothing. So I do think there's been more kind of behind the scenes pushback. And certainly even mainstream Republicans, even Donald Trump, who called himself the father of IVF, has absolutely no interest in prioritizing that issue.
Karen Guzzo is the director of the Carolina Population Center and a sociology professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She's one of the leading family demographers in this country. Jill Filipovic is an attorney, columnist at Slate, and has a Substack titled Through Line, and she's the one who said, pregnancy is contagious. And you know what? So is good conversation. So thank you for spreading that germ.
Thanks, Brian.
Thanks for having us.
WNYC's journalism and storytelling is heard by millions of passionate listeners. Sponsors of our programming gain our listeners' attention and their respect. Learn about how your organization can support WNYC and WNYC Studios at sponsorship.wnyc.org.